My name is Bill Wellock. I'm a public relations officer here at Florida State University. Welcome to our annual briefing for media ahead of the 2024 Atlantic hurricane season, which begins June 1st. This briefing is an opportunity for media to hear from FSU experts in various disciplines and participate in a question and answer session. I'm recording this briefing and I'll send it to media for use in your coverage. We've also prepared a list of faculty who can speak about all sorts of topics that might be helpful in coverage, including forecasting, emergency management, environmental law, evacuations, insurance, coastal wildlife, and other topics. I will send that list to you later this afternoon. Our goal with that list is for it to be a resource for you in any sort of preseason coverage, but also throughout hurricane season and even beyond. To that end, it includes contact information for faculty. Feel free to reach out to them. And you can always reach out to me and my office for help finding a source or getting in touch with the faculty member. So without further ado, let's begin our briefing. Joining us today is Professor Patricia Bourne, the Payne H. and Charlotte Hodges Media Eminent Scholar in Risk Management and Insurance in the College of Business. Professor Bourne researches insurance market structure and performance, professional liability, the management of catastrophic risk, such as hurricanes and other natural disasters. She's a past president of the American Risk and Insurance Association and the Risk Theory Society. I will let Professor Bourne tell you more about her expertise.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here to answer questions you might have about the upcoming hurricane season. And just a couple things about myself. I'm from the Risk Management and Insurance Department in the College of Business, and I do have a lot of colleagues that are interested in these topics as well. So I feel like one representative of a lot of expertise that we have over in our department. I study a lot of issues related to the insurance market response to catastrophic events and how we can support with more or less regulation of the insurance market. I also a bit of a mixed bag because I look at health outcomes in the health insurance market, which is surprisingly as complicated maybe as the catastrophic issues that we face in the property insurance market. But that I'll leave it there. Happy to answer any questions you have later.
Fantastic. Thank you, Professor Bourne. Also joining us is Professor of Meteorology, Mark Bourassa. Professor Bourassa is the Associate Director of the Center for Ocean Atmospheric Prediction Studies, also known by its acronym COAPS. Faculty at the center perform interdisciplinary research to understand the interactions occurring among the Earth's oceans, atmosphere, land, and ice, and how they affect the climate. He's an expert on the network of global meteorological and oceanographic observations that inform forecasts and the identification of tropical disturbances, which are possible precursors to tropical cyclones. Thank you for joining us, Professor Bourassa.
Thank you. So one more detail, my expertise is also on observing the tropical cyclones with remote sensing, aircrafts, whatever, and on the physics of how they work. My particular interest is how the ocean and the atmosphere interact to power these systems or to slow it down. Thanks, Bill.
Fantastic, thank you. Also joining us from the Center for Ocean Atmospheric Prediction Studies is researcher and state climatologist David Zierden. His work involves climate monitoring that can be used by people, institutions, and businesses of Florida and the surrounding region. That research is used by the agriculture, forestry, and water resource sectors to give some examples, and I will let David explain a little more.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Yes, I am the Florida State climatologist here at the Center for Ocean Atmospheric Prediction Studies. I have a long background in climate variability, the El Nino La Nina cycle, which has a major influence on the Atlantic hurricane season, relative activity of the number of storms and such. So I look at it from the climate side of things, and yeah, so I've been studying that for a while, participated in some studies that were here at COAPS, and can look at the long-term view of the amount of hurricanes we're going to have in a season and can help interpret the seasonal forecasts from like Colorado State University and NOAA.
Great. Thank you very much, David. Our fourth faculty participant is Pedro Fernández-Cabán, an assistant professor at the FAMU FSU College of Engineering and a member of the Resilient Infrastructure and Disaster Response Center, or RIDER. He uses both laboratory and field experiments to assess the structural performance of civil infrastructure during windstorm events. Some of his recent work focused on developing machine learning models to predict hurricane wind fields and their interaction with coastal landscapes. Professor Fernández-Cabán, could you please tell us a little more about your latest research?
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, so my background is primarily on looking at hurricane impact from the engineering side, looking at surface level wind fields, we call them ground level wind fields, and their interaction with civil infrastructure. So we're looking at extreme wind events and how these extreme wind fields essentially impact civil infrastructure, buildings, and other type lifelines, for example. We conduct some field studies during hurricane events to collect wind data. And also we bring that knowledge to the laboratory and we conduct wind tunnel testings, for example, to try to characterize the wind loading specifically and trying to update codes and standards. And we also now we're trying to integrate some machine learning into the problem to try to sort of expand our knowledge beyond some of the observations that we see in the field and in wind tunnel studies. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you, Bill.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Fernández-Cabán. Finally, also joining us is Erin Ryan, the Elizabeth C. and Clyde W. Atkinson Professor and Associate Dean for Environmental Programs at the FSU College of Law. Professor Ryan specializes in environmental governance and environmental, water, property, and land use law. She's appeared in the Associated Press, Chicago Tribune, National Public Radio, and other media outlets for her expertise. Thank you, Professor Ryan.
Thank you, Bill. And yes, my expertise sits at the intersection of environmental law and property and land use law. And I direct the environmental law program here at FSU Law. What I have been studying most recently perhaps has become more controversial since the signing of yesterday's HB 1645 bill that removes climate change from governing priorities for the state of Florida, or at least removes some former requirements to think about it. My specific research focus recently has been on uses of legal doctrines like the public trust doctrine and other environmental rights doctrines by plaintiffs, especially youth plaintiffs around Florida, around the country, and around the world, seeking to advocate for more climate change regulation at these different levels of government. And so my expertise, in addition to environmental law and policy, is with federalism and multi-level governance, negotiated governance between state, local, federal, and international agents of governance.
Great. Thank you, Professor Ryan. And thank you to all our faculty members for sharing their expertise. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. If anyone has a question, feel free to chime in on this call. If you prefer, you could send me a message in the chat and I will ask it. Is there anyone who would like to begin?
I'll begin. This is Amy Green. I'm the Florida correspondent at Inside Climate News, and with the experts, just talk generally about what we can expect from hurricane season this year.
Yes, this is David Zierden, and what we're looking at this year, Colorado State University and Phil Klotzbach released their initial forecast back on April 4th. They're looking at a very active season with an average of 23 named storms and 11 hurricanes, which is a forecast for a very active season. We are anticipated to go into the La Nina phase of the Pacific Ocean, which favors a more active Atlantic hurricane season, and also sea surface temperatures in the North Atlantic Ocean, and specifically the main development region from the coast of Africa through the Caribbean are running at record levels right now as far as sea surface temperatures and warmth. So these two conditions combined, we're looking at a very active season this year. NOAA will release their seasonal forecast on May 23rd next week. So we'll be looking forward to that, but I'm sure they will also be forecasting an active season.
And can you provide any context on that? I mean, is this like, you know, the most active season that, you know, has ever been forecast, or one of the most active, or, you know, can you talk a little, can you put that a little in more historical context?
Sure. Michael Mann and Penn University released a forecast where they forecasted 33 named storms, which would be a record. The record is 30 in 2020. So you got to be careful forecasting a new record, but yeah, all indications are that we'll have a very active season. And also it might not be the number of storms that we see during the season, but these very warm sea surface temperatures and oceanic heat content can fuel stronger storms also. So that's something we need to be aware of.
Right. So it's not a record number of hurricanes is being forecast. 15 is the record in 2005. But it's a lot.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Michael Mann was forecasting 33 named storms.
Yeah, very different. Very different. Right. So you worry more about hurricanes than named storms for damage. So I thought that was a good statistic to add in. Not contradicting anything David said.
No, thank you, Dr. Bourassa.
Yeah. And then the other question, of course, is where they'll go. So it's not really how many named storms you have, it's how many landfalls. And that's harder to forecast.
And can you provide any more information on the sea surface temperatures and how that compares to this time last year?
Yes, the latest analysis I saw is that sea surface temperatures in the main development region are as warm as they normally are in mid-August right now. So that's what we're looking at. The sea surface temperatures in that region were record warm last year, and we're even above that going into this hurricane season.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Amy. Mark, let me get to your question real quick. I see another one in the chat here from John Kennedy. Governor DeSantis and the legislature have enacted many steps aimed at bolstering the property insurance market with the goal of reducing homeowners' costs, but that doesn't seem to be happening. Professor Bourne, do you see any light at the end of the tunnel? Are we just a single storm away from this market worsening?
Yeah, so the steps that the legislature have taken are definitely starting to play out in the market, but it's going to still be a little bit of time before we see the improvement to insurance companies' bottom line actually going through to reduction in premiums. And at the same time that we're trying to reduce the litigation costs that insurers are facing that have led to some increasing prices, we have more events occurring. And so there are kind of competing influences on the prices that people are paying for homeowners costs. On the one hand, more predicted damages to their homes. At the same time, higher cost for insurers doing business that we do hope is going to start to fall. So we should be seeing the homeowners premiums leveling off a little bit more, at least, probably not coming down significantly, just given the nature of the storms. I do see some light at the end of the tunnel because I see a lot of activity. There's a lot of people trying to figure out how to save the insurance market in Florida, and activities including the My Safe Florida Home, trying to get people to mitigate. There does seem to be some activity in that area. The commissioner a couple of weeks ago was talking about how across the state he's seeing a lot more people replacing roofs with more composite material. things that are going to withstand the hurricanes better. You know, long term, we're doing fine. Looking right now at this particular hurricane season, it's a little harder to be real optimistic about where we are. The message in the chat asked if we're one storm away from the market worsening. I think any storm worsens the market, at least temporarily, but Citizens, the insurer that's had a lot of the that's bearing a lot of the risk in the state, has been pushing policies out to some private insurers that do have capital. And if we can spread the risk out to more insurers that have capital behind this, then I'm pretty optimistic that, you know, one storm's not going to kill us. A couple storms may be a little bit more of an issue. You know, if this is a season where we have 2 or 3 hurricanes, we're going to be facing some concerns. But also on that, I want to say that although the cost of the homeowners policies, the coverage has been going up, people can get coverage. Most people are getting coverage, if not from a private insurer, they're insured through Citizens. So it's a good thing to know from a social point of view that we don't have a huge gap with people being uninsured going into this season, that people are insuring and they are mitigating, and the message is getting out about the importance of both of those.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Bourne. Thank you, John, for that question. Mark Schleifstein, would you like to speak as well?
Sure. So I'm in South Louisiana, and South Louisiana has a bit different problem from most of Florida in terms of evacuation, in that it's really sort of limited by contraflow programs and staged evacuations. There's real concern this year by state officials that evacuations might have to be abandoned because of rapid intensification of storms in the Gulf of Mexico. Are you guys looking at those concerns, and any hints for what we should be looking for in the Gulf of Mexico for the potential for rapid intensification from the loop current and or other things? And are there anything you guys are doing to help speed the time frame for evacuations?
Well, like you said, keeping track of the areas of warm water is important. So there's a new satellite up that will better locate the eddies of warm water or cold water. So cold water will reduce the strength, warm water will increase it. It's the fuel that feeds the storms. So having those in the right place will help forecast. So that should improve forecast activity once the data are assimilated into the weather forecast. I can't say when that'll happen, but at least the people looking at the forecasts at the Hurricane Center and interpreting them will have better positions of the areas of warm water. So that's one thing that'll help.
I guess I can weigh in, although I don't think it will be very helpful, because I understand that our objective here is to try to help the people who are in the path of the storm get out of the path of the storm. And what I'm going to say doesn't really advance that goal. But as I'm sure you know, one of the longer term policy responses to problems like this, and problems evacuating and then problems restoring, are zoning-based plans of strategic retreat. Nobody who lives in Florida or Louisiana wants to hear anything about having to move their home or their family. But over time, one of the land use planning responses to this kind of problem is to think really carefully about where to build and rebuild, how to fund, what incentives to create. So while that doesn't help people who are in the path of the storms we expect this summer, it is something that policymakers and probably insurance providers will also be thinking about as time moves forward and we continue to deal with storms of these magnitudes that may be difficult to escape.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark and Erin. And Mark Schleifstein from New Orleans, not on this call, but in our larger list are evacuation experts, so they may also have some more insight for you. Thank you very much for the question. I think we have in the chat a follow-up question for Dr. Bourne. Dr. Bourne, can you speak more about the types of insurers that Citizens is moving policyholders to, and what checks might be in place to make sure those insurers have enough capital?
Yeah, so I think the concern is that some of these policies are going to companies that are mostly based in Florida and selling policies only in Florida. So the ability for these insurers to diversify is limited. But in terms of the checks that are in place, the insurers that write in Florida have to submit catastrophe modeling output. And if an insurance company has an aggregation of risk that's in a particular area, it's going to show up as something that the commissioner's office is going to get concerned with. So most of the companies that are coming in and saying that they will take these policies out of Citizens have to show that they don't have an aggregation of risk, say with a lot of coverage in Miami or in one particular area. That's the best check we can make with any insurance company that takes some of the risk in Florida. Is are they diversified, and to the extent that they're diversified, on top or not diversified, how much capital do they have? And we have requirements that they hold a certain amount of capital. It follows from the catastrophe models. I serve on the Florida Commission for Hurricane Loss Projection Methodology. We evaluate all these models. There's a lot of details in those catastrophe models that try to pick up the kinds of risks that insurance companies might be facing that lead to this, what we call aggregation of too much risk in certain parts of the state. So I think we're going to be, we got to rely on the checks we have in place, on looking at the capitalization, looking at what the insurance companies are doing to diversify across the state, so they're not hit with a fundamental event.
Great. Thank you, Professor Bourne. Thank you, Mira. Let us know if there are any follow-ups to that question. I had a question of my own for Professor Fernández-Cabán. You had mentioned some of your research into how we design and build infrastructure, I believe, and structures in general. Is there any need, in your opinion, for changes or updates to regulations with that?
Well, also in our field, we're always updating codes and standards, building codes. So that's always we're generating and we're learning as we go. So we're conducting research in wind tunnels. So there's always room for improvements. Building codes right now and the latest versions of building codes are we've learned a lot actually from previous hurricanes. In the case of Florida, Hurricane Andrew in 1992. After 1992, there was a lot of new provisions that were added to building codes. So we've significantly improved our current standards. There's still some uncertainties as far as the storm intensity and whether some of the hurricanes, landfalling hurricanes that we've experienced recently are in some areas where we see damage, structural damage, for example, to buildings, whether they're actually getting up to design level events, or if it's other factors that are contributing. For example, when you look at building components that might be older building components, retrofitting, roof-to-wall connections, some of those things that might be degrading over time could also contribute. So sometimes it's more the local effect of some of these storms, which vary in space and time. So the localities of these recent systems, it's a factor. So when we see structural damage out in the field, it varies. You can be looking at a particular community and the damage varies. So there's some local effects there that are difficult to predict. There's uncertainties in the wind field, and at the same time, there's uncertainties as far as the building and when it was built, and there's other factors that go into play there.
Okay, great, thank you. And another follow-up question. Oh, actually, hold on. Let's get to this question from John Kennedy. He asks, following recent major destructive storms such as Hurricanes Michael, Irma, and Ian, Florida is largely rebuilding in the same areas that were destroyed. Is the private insurance industry sending a message to Florida that this is not a good idea through high rates and lack of availability? Or does the industry not take a position on whether some areas should not be rebuilt?
So what the industry, the insurance industry cares about is being able to pay claims, which means that if there are, if risk is increasing in certain areas, they want to charge enough to bear that risk. I don't know that you want to say the industry takes a position on whether certain areas should be rebuilt or not. I think they should. I think they should potentially, tell contractors that they're not going to provide builders risk coverage in areas where they're trying to build. But in general, the way that the insurance industry can incentivize people to try to build in other areas is by raising the rates. And I think they're doing that. I think they raise the rates in places where it probably doesn't make sense to rebuild, but any risk can be insured for a price. And some people are going to build again on the same place if they can get insurance for whatever price that is. I don't think the insurance industry is trying necessarily to say we're just not going to cover in those areas. Although that is an issue with some parts of the state and some insurers trying not to get too exposed in some areas.
Yeah, and if I could follow up just to say, again, I feel like the Cruella de Vil of the conversation, because I'm going to make all the comments that are not helpful to people who need help right now, but are the kinds of policy questions that policymakers are wrestling with. Your question is right on target about how to incentivize development where it's the bloodless word would be efficient, meaning that it's possible to ensure and protect without diverting policy priority funding from and resources from other policy priorities. But the analogy would be the federal flood insurance program, which for many, many years has been blamed for subsidizing and attracting nuisance development in flood-prone areas where we can almost guarantee that the insurance will be needed over and over again. And the kind of academic critique is that it is confusing or creating a market failure by frustrating the signals that a well-operating free market would normally respond by. In a free market, if it's too expensive to build, eventually people would not build. Insurance is an important humanitarian institution to protect us, where we can pool risk and sort of protect individuals, but it can have the inadvertent effect of sending these mixed market signals to incentivize development that probably isn't efficient. So we end up in this uncomfortable place between our desire to help people who are already living in flood-prone areas, hurricane-prone areas, which is most of our state, but also wrestling with the policy implications of subsidizing risk through insurance and statewide insurance programs like Florida. So I am not Cruella de Vil. I believe in insurance. I'm not here to say that we shouldn't have it. But it is worth thinking about the market implications, the market failure created by over-incentivizing development in uninsurable places.
Great. Thank you, Professor Bourne and Professor Ryan, for that question. Are there any other questions at the moment?
I would ask a follow-up question about the upcoming hurricane season. When you look at an outlook like this, how surprising or how shocking is an outlook like this? I know a lot of Floridians and others in Hurricane Alley will, hear about an outlook like that and, have a lot of anxiety for the coming season. What is your reaction as experts on these issues? Is this very surprising or shocking?
David or Mark, if either of you guys have a thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, we're pretty sure a La Nina would be coming, which means more hurricanes. We knew the temperatures were warm, which means potentially stronger hurricanes in the absence of other things that would weaken them. And in La Nina, that absence is more present. So it shouldn't be a surprise if you follow that kind of thing. Now, a lot of people don't, so it could be a surprise for them. You know, for Floridians looking at the impact on their insurance, it might be horrifying, but it's not a complete surprise. Does that get at what you were trying to ask about?
Yeah, I mean, I just, as we grapple with, the warming global climate, and as these hurricane seasons become more and more active, is it like, holy crap, I've never seen an outlook like this before, or is this more like, yeah, this is where we're at this point in, with the changing global climate?
We can't say yet. It takes way more years, and these are such a spotty number of events each year. It would take longer for us to get statistics to answer that question than we want to deal with. So the other things to think about is, are the things that inhibit the growth of hurricanes changing as well as the sea surface temperature? Almost certainly, and we don't know how. Then another one is, where are the hurricanes going to go? Are the large-scale wind patterns that steer the hurricanes changing? Hypothetically, people have suggested they are changing in La Nina years that follow El Nino, and that the storms will curve northward further out to sea. And if that's true, that's a good thing for Florida. Maybe not for Bermuda, but it would mean less landfalling storms and less risk from of serious costs of damage on land. For Atlantic storms. For Gulf storms, it's less clear how that will impact the steering. It could mean more for Louisiana, but it's really, really hard to say. Those are the extra factors I'd consider. The things that reduce the strength of storms and where they're going.
Okay, thank you, Amy, for that question. Mark, for your response. There are no other questions. I have a question for Professor Bourne, and forgive me if you answered this already, because I think you spoke to it a little bit. But are there any anticipated changes with the market in the next year, or a couple of years, either through legislation or otherwise, that you are following and anticipating or looking forward to try to understand?
Aside from things I've said about the citizens, depopulating a little bit, and efforts to get private insurers back into the state, the way we're going to bolster the insurance market is to get big insurers with lots of capital to be willing to write policies at an actuarially fair rate. And right now the challenge is there's a lot of other sources of uncertainty in Florida. I am optimistic that the changes to the assignment of benefits, reducing that type of litigation, that activity, that is going to play out over the next year or two, and it's going to reduce what I think of as kind of a political uncertainty of being in Florida, and this litigation uncertainty that's making it hard for insurers that say, well, we kind of know the catastrophes that we can deal with in other states, and we know we have certain amount of flexibility in how we address those. But when we go into Florida and we try to bear the risk that the Florida property market faces, we got to worry about the lawyers, we got to worry about the regulators, we got to worry about a lot of other things that are just making it a little bit harder for them. And if we can get a handle on what that is, and I think watching a few new companies come in to the state and watching State Farm, who mostly tried to leave the state, they're starting to pick up more coverage in the state. That those signs are good, because it says, I mentioned earlier, a lot of people are looking at this issue. We don't want the insurance market in Florida to fail. So where does the bolstering come from? Part of it's the trying to make the uncertainty that exists in the market simply the catastrophe uncertainty, not everything else that could be adding to this. And because we can't get rid of the catastrophe uncertainty. We don't know about the storms. We can model them as best we can, and the models are getting better and better, adapting to even the climate change trends that we see. So I think we've got a lot of positive things happening in the market that are going to help consumers. Say we're not looking to make insurance affordable for Floridians. The insurance industry can't come out and say we're going to try to make it something that everyone can buy. It's got to be fairly priced so that it's reflecting the risk, and that is going to lead to some people having trouble getting insurance or budgeting for insurance when they've got other expenses. It will lead to some complaints about how much insurance costs, but I think the market is going to be it's going to survive this, whatever this looks like right now in the state, and even through the next wave of hurricanes.
Thank you very much. Professor Ryan, similar question for you. Is there anything you are, any anticipated changes that you are following and wondering how they will affect your sector?
So in my field of expertise, there are kind of two places where these questions play out. And one is in the litigation and policymaking sphere. And the other is in sort of private decision-making on the basis of those policies. And not just private decision-making, but communities making decisions. So I was at a conference this weekend where there were some really novel proposals for dynamic zoning in light of climate change. The proposal was to use machine learning to identify the actual risk on a parcel-to-parcel basis to understand, to better inform decisions about insurance and zoning to take account of risk. Although dynamic zoning obviously stands in some tension to the reliance interests that residents normally have in a zoning plan. They build in reliance on a zoning plan, and then if the zoning shifts dynamically, that has other problematic ramifications. But it's a problematic situation where the risk really does seem to be dynamic, and we didn't used to have freestanding tornadoes in Tallahassee, and then we had two of them last week. So one place where this is unfolding is how people are thinking about land use planning and how individuals make decisions about where they want to live to the extent they have the freedom to make those choices. And then the other place is in the policymaking and litigation sphere, and that's been really active. If you are paying attention, you will notice there's been quite a lot of legal developments at the level of the Supreme Court, interpreting some of the major statute programs that bear on this, whether the Clean Air Act has something to say about regulating greenhouse gas emissions, what the Inflation Reduction Act is going to fund in terms of developing clean energy. These are at the federal level. Obviously, the state statute that I mentioned at the beginning of our meeting today, Governor DeSantis signed it into law yesterday. That sort of goes in the opposite direction. It removes climate governance as a priority for the state of Florida. It's been pointed out that law does not actually constrain Florida's legislature or policymakers from taking any specific steps. It's mostly a ceremonial or symbolic change that simply restates priorities. But that symbolism is important. It has political power. So, and then I guess the final thing I'll mention are private individuals and organizations advocating for changed policy. So as I mentioned, I study a movement of climate litigation, climate advocacy that has become especially popular among young people who see the developments at the Supreme Court level, which they interpret as disempowering conventional environmental laws. So they're now advocating for climate governance under other constitutional principles, like there's an argument for a due process right to a livable climate that has been litigated all the way up to the federal level and has been interpreted in some state constitutional provisions. Most recently in Montana, these youth plaintiffs succeeded in convincing the Supreme Court of Montana that an environmental right provision in the Montana Constitution bears on fossil fuel development policy. New York State recently amended its constitution to include an environmental rights provision, just like the Montana provision, after advocates, not only around climate, but for other reasons, this environmental rights provision was included. But because of the Montana case in the climate litigation context, I believe 9 or 10 other states now have paperwork on file to amend their constitutions with similar environmental rights provisions, mostly spearheaded by climate advocates who are looking for other legal levers to affect policy changes that they hope will mitigate climate change or the increasing impacts of climate change rather than simply adapting to them, which has been what most of our conversation today has been about.
Okay, thank you, Professor Ryan. We had another question in the chat here, question on upcoming hurricane season. Professor Bourne, could you speak to what the outlook for this upcoming hurricane season means for Florida's insurance industry? Amy, am I getting that all accurately?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Sure. So when the insurance companies hear about a season that might be worse than usual, there's not a lot they can do in terms of collecting additional premium. Policies are written, policies are enforced right now. They can prepare in terms of looking for where their capital is and making sure that it's liquid to pay claims. And on that, I think insurers are thinking about how they can mobilize their forces for looking at hurricane damage. They get better and better at getting people out to the sites, whether it's by using drones and other resources now that allow the insurers to understand what the losses look like really quickly and get payments out. The quicker they can respond to one event or two events, whatever it looks like this year, the less likely it is that claims go into some kind of litigation, and homeowners get back on their feet and our society becomes more resilient. I think the industry is really looking at how to help in that way. So when there's a bad season predicted, it just pushes the insurance companies to think even more about that. Like, how can we be ready if there's 2 events in Florida and we need to mobilize claims adjusters in multiple parts of the state? Their business plans are looking at that. As I've said before, in terms of how much they have to pay the claims, there's not much the insurance companies can do at this point to raise additional capital, but there are lots of reinsurance arrangements, and I didn't mention this before, but a positive sign. I spent today at Lloyd's of London. People this year are not complaining. The people here in London are not complaining about the Florida market. Like they have. Last year, they said they didn't want to touch us, and this year they're not real bullish on it, but they're actually more neutral, which is nice to hear that the reinsurance market softened enough that the insurers that are going to be hit, have that backdrop, and that there's the reinsurance capital is also supporting what might happen this year, and yeah, so I think that's all a positive sign.
Thank you very much, Professor Bourne and Amy, for the question. I had another question for David and Mark, talking about looking forward, any sort of anticipated changes. Are there any sort of new tools or methods for forecasting that have been developed recently or this year that are rolling out that you could speak of? Any sort of improvements in how you do that part of your work?
Neither of us do much with the forecasting part itself. So some of the new observation tools which will feed into the forecasts are the satellite I talked about. It covers 5% of the Earth each day. So if you get enough of that data in advance, it'll help. There are some improvements going into the way we measure winds in a storm, which will help the forecasters. So right now we get them from satellite aircraft, quite a few different instruments on aircraft. So we've done a deep dive over the last year into intercalibrating those instruments and found some things that are kind of scary, some that are good, and we're going to try to resolve some of that over the next year. So that should give the forecasters better information about storm intensity, which will help intensity forecasts. In terms of modeling, people are moving to include more physics. They're going to higher resolution. So they're getting more complicated physics with the clouds and water vapor processes, which is a key part of the storm. We're trying to improve the surface physics. That's a bigger task. So in the recent years, we've had a couple things change observationally. We've figured out how to make use of parachuted instruments that drop from aircraft. So the people that fly these airplanes into storms drop little instruments on parachutes that get blown around by the wind. And we can use those to estimate how much drag there is at the surface, which is something we haven't been able to do before. People are making surface sailboats called sail drones that can be, if they're lucky, they can get in front of the storm and take measurements as it goes over them. And we're getting similar observations from those. So combining these will give us a better picture of the drag on the bottom of a hurricane. And why is that important? It's because that's about half the factor that would go into estimating intensity correctly. So it has a big impact. Let me see. Those are the ones I'm familiar with. David, are you familiar with others?
No, I just have a couple editorial comments on this along the lines of this question. One, the National Hurricane Center, their official forecast tracks and warning cones and such, they improve almost yearly. So we're getting better and better at forecasting the track. Intensity is still kind of a problem, getting the intensity right, but forecast tracks are improving yearly. And also another editorial comment, I get questions from friends and family. They see these spaghetti plots on the news and stuff, and they ask me, well, which model is better? Guess what? The National Hurricane Center have experts that go over with a fine-tooth comb all these model outputs, and they do an extremely good job of it. So trust the official forecast from the Hurricane Center and from the National Weather Service. That's my main point right now. I don't have any secret model that knows better than they do, I promise.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, David and Mark. Pedro, similar question for you. I'm just curious, is there anything, on the horizon that we could look toward as, an interesting story looking forward about how to improve your work?
Oh yeah, no, definitely. So as far as field deployment efforts during hurricanes, we've collaborated with other universities to deploy weather stations. And these are portable systems, movable, so you can basically put them where we expect the strongest winds to happen. So that's data that's very limited as far as ground level data. And it's basically a regular weather station, basically a lattice tower with anemometers, so we can place them in strategic locations. One of the limitations that we've had is storm surge. So you're limited as far as how far you can go and get close to the coastline. So we're developing new systems that we can deploy closer to the shoreline, and they can resist storm surge. So those are locations where we essentially don't have a lot of wind data, just because of the storm surge and some of the instruments surviving or being able to resist those extreme conditions. So those are new systems that we're developing in collaboration with other universities to sort of capture those extreme wind fields that are happening near the shoreline. And these systems are going to be able to resist the extreme conditions that are happening during the storm.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And I see Mark here noted in the chat. He's collaborating on a new satellite mission proposal that will measure surface winds and currents covering about 90% of the Earth every day. Wow, that is pretty incredible. All right. Well, are there any further questions? I think we're coming up on an hour.
Just if the experts have anything else to add on the most interesting aspects of the outlook this season, or the most fascinating aspects.
No, this is David Zierden. I really don't have anything to add. I'm very anxiously awaiting the NOAA outlook next week and hear what they have to say about the upcoming hurricane season. And again, with the very warm, almost or record warm sea surface temperatures, it is concerning just how strong a hurricane could possibly become. But these seasonal outlooks cannot forecast landfalls or where they will occur. So,
hey Regan, listen, I've been listening to this.
Sorry about that. Were you finished, David? Sorry.
yeah, I think that's about it.
Okay.
So the seasonal outlooks can't forecast where these storms might occur or if they'll make landfall or where they'll make landfall. So we have to be equally prepared just about any year.
Yeah, landfall is the biggest uncertainty. So you can have several named storms, but as far as landfall and the location where it makes landfall, it's a big question. And rapid intensification, the warm water effect is also something to keep an eye on. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's basically just you have a certain number of named storms, but the ones that are making landfall are the ones that we're interested in.
Fantastic, thank you. Sorry, one other question we got I think this is for David and Mark and Pedro. Are you worried about the retirement of larger scale Earth-focused satellites that may be coming to the end of their working lifetimes?
I'm sorry, this question was for me, just when we had a few extra minutes. Do you know the ones I'm talking about? I'm wondering how it impacts your work, if at all, the retirement of those sequentially, those 3 large Earth-focused satellites.
It doesn't impact mine much because they're alternative instruments that will cover many of the observations we would need. So cloud cover would be the obvious example in this context. The bigger question, though, if you want to get into that, is that we have a new policy on how on satellites having to be deorbited. So any instrument we put up now is going to last a shorter amount of time because we have to have the extra fuel on board to deorbit it. And some of the agencies are interpreting it in a very draconian way where they're going to try to keep the instrument only up and active for a few years. And in the past, they've gone up and they keep working for as long, they keep being used as long as they're working. Now there's too much space junk, so I understand the policy. But it does have an impact on the need to more rapidly put these instruments up in the future, and that could have some very interesting changes in the observing system.
Interesting. All right. Thank you very much. If there are no further questions, I'd just like to thank all our faculty for joining us today and sharing your expertise. It's always fascinating to hear from you and learn a little bit about what you're understanding and studying. And I want to thank all of the media for joining us today. And I will send this recording as well as our larger list of experts to you. Again, this is a resource for you, so feel free to reach out to any faculty, to myself, and please, we love seeing it in your coverage, and we like to help to amplify that as well. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a great rest of the day.